Breakpoints are a fundamental tool in debugging application code. In this video, I'll show you some of the breakpoint basics. First, let's look at the application code. I'm inside this project using breakpoints, and the code that I'm going to look at for this demo is in main window.xaml. This is a WPF application. It has a simple user interface with two buttons. And if you look at the source code inside this main window.xaml.cs file, you'll see that the code is very simple. On the first button handler, I'm declaring some variables, and then I'm building up a string and outputting it to a text block here on line 33. In the second method, I'm declaring some variables on line 39 through 41. These are numeric variables. I'm doing some math operations, and then I'm outputting the results. The only purpose of this code is so I have a place to put breakpoints, so I can show you how to add and remove breakpoints and some of the other tools inside Visual Studio. First, let's see what happens when I run the application. If you want to hit your breakpoint, you need to have the debugger attached to the running application. So you want to use this item, start debugging. If you use the second item, start without debugging, it's the same as if you had gone out to the hard drive and run the executable without attaching the debugger first. So I'll choose this first item, start debugging, or F5. And then when I click on these buttons, you'll see the results on the bottom of the window. Notice I didn't hit any breakpoints because I don't have any breakpoints. So I'll stop the application, return back to this method, and I'll add a breakpoint here on line 31. Now there's several ways you can add a breakpoint. One way is to go over to the left side of the screen. There's a gray margin over there, or a gray bar here. And if you click in the margin, you'll see a red dot appear. That red dot represents a breakpoint. And you'll see that if I hover over this, I get some information about where the breakpoint is, what line number, what method it's inside. And you also see that there are some other floating items here. There's a settings button and a disable breakpoint button. I'll talk more about these later in the course. You'll also notice the background of my line of code has changed to red. These are both indicators that there's a breakpoint set on this line of code. Now I'll turn off this breakpoint. Since I added it by clicking on the left margin, I can remove it by clicking here. One click turns it on, then another click turns it off. Now I prefer the keystroke. I like to use a keyboard shortcut, so I'll use F9 to toggle the breakpoint on, and then press F9 again to toggle it off. Toggle it on one more time. Now I'm ready to hit my breakpoint, or stop on my breakpoint, or debug my application, whichever term you want to use. So I'll go back up to my debug menu and choose Start Debugging. I'll click on this first button. And now, if you look on line 31, you'll see some new things. Over in the margin, there's a yellow arrow superimposed over the red dot. That's the current executing line of code. You'll also see that if I move my cursor down one line, that the red background has changed to yellow. So that yellow signifies the line of code that's going to run next. Later in this course, I'll show you how to move around in your code after you've hit a breakpoint. After you've looked at the code here and you're ready to move on, you can go up here and click on the Continue button or press F5 to continue. And now you see the output on the bottom of the screen. All right, back into Visual Studio. I'll move down to this next method and we'll look at some alternate ways of adding breakpoints. Now, one caveat of using breakpoints is you can't put a breakpoint on a line of code that is not going to execute. So a comment like on line 42, I can't put a breakpoint here. If I try, you'll see a message on the bottom of the screen down there. It says a breakpoint could not be inserted at this location. It's also the same with this variable. You see this variable here? I declared a double value of x. I'm not doing anything with that value here. I'm just declaring it. So Visual Studio will not let me put a breakpoint here. I can put a breakpoint here, but not on line 39. See that same error showing up on the bottom of the screen. A breakpoint could not be inserted at this location. It's different on line 41 because I'm declaring a variable and I'm also assigning a value to that variable. So breakpoints are legal on this line. Another way of adding a breakpoint is by right-clicking in my code and choosing this context menu here, Insert Breakpoint. Another way of adding a breakpoint is to go to your Debug menu and look at this section here. There's a toggle breakpoint and a new breakpoint. The one that we want for this video is this first one, the F9 shortcut. This toggles it on and off. There's also one called New Breakpoint, which has a couple items in here called a function breakpoint and a data breakpoint. I'll talk about those later. So let's click here, that toggle it on, and if I go back to that menu and click on this menu item again, it'll toggle it off. So how many breakpoints do I have? I have 3 in this file, plus I think I have 1 up here in the other method. I have 4 breakpoints here. I'll also go over to this financial.cs file. I'll add a breakpoint on the method declare. Now I tried to click here on the method declare, but again, this is not something that you can run. So what Visual Studio did is it added the breakpoint to the first line of code, the curly brace. Now these breakpoints are saved per developer. So if you're working on a team with 3 developers and we all open this same project and I put my breakpoints in my code, they're not going to show up when the other 2 developers open their files. Their breakpoints are saved on their machines. My breakpoint is saved on my computer. Now, if I shut down this project, if I go here and I choose close solution and reopen it, those breakpoints are preserved somewhere in my hard drive. When I reopen the project, you'll see my breakpoint's still there. Also, my tabs are still here at the top of my screen. So if I go back to this main window.xaml.cs file, I'll see my breakpoints over there. Let me show you where these files are saved on your hard drive. I'll choose Open Folder in File Explorer. And if you worked in other versions of Visual Studio, older versions, you may be familiar with a file called an SUO file. So there's an SLN file here. There used to be an SUO file here in the same folder. That's where your tabs were saved, and that's where your breakpoints were saved. They're still here, but they're no longer in the folder with the solution. They're in this .vs folder. If you do not see this .vs folder, you need to go to the View menu and choose Hidden Items. Turn that on so you can see this folder. And now if you drill down into this folder, a few steps, you'll see this file with no name, but just an extension, this .suo file. That's your user settings. What I'll do is return back to Visual Studio, close the solution, delete this SUO file here in File Explorer. That should remove my breakpoints and my other settings. Return back to Visual Studio and reopen the project. And you see my tabs are no longer here and my breakpoints are gone. Now, of course, you don't need to go out and delete that file. Most of the time that file's hidden. You don't need to worry about it. I like to show it to you because I think it's interesting. If you really do want to remove all your breakpoints, let me add a few of them here, and I'll show you another way of removing all your breakpoints. Go back to your debug menu and choose Delete All Breakpoints. Click on Yes, and all your breakpoints in your entire solution will disappear. Now you know a few ways to add breakpoints to your code. Next, I'll look at the debug windows that are available when stopped at a breakpoint.